He thought it was just another midnight ride. But when a pregnant CEO collapsed in the back seat of his Uber, his entire life shifted with the squeal of hospital doors. 9 months later, when he least expected it, she stood on his doorstep holding more than gratitude in her eyes. Before we dive in, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind and your heart wide open. Jake Miller had picked up hundreds of rides in his life, most of them forgettable. Tourists with dead phone batteries fumbling in broken English, office workers too drunk to find their wallets, couples who argued in whispers in the back seat like he wasn't there. He thought this one would be the same, a late-night request pinging his phone at the corner of Lexington and 47th, the kind of ride that meant a small fare and maybe a few minutes of silence before the next call. At 11:47 p.m., he eased his dented Toyota Camry up to the curb, headlights washing over the glassy surface of a corporate tower that loomed above him like it had swallowed half the sky. The back door opened, and everything ordinary shattered. A woman in a tailored suit half fell into the seat, one hand clawing at her stomach, the other fumbling for balance against the armrest. Her blonde hair, neatly pinned only minutes ago, was already unraveling, strands sticking to her damp forehead. Jake twisted in his seat, startled. Her face was bloodless, lips trembling, breath caught in jagged bursts. "Hospital," she choked out, her voice breaking on the word. Jake didn't ask which one. He didn't ask if she had insurance, if she needed to call someone, if she was sure. He just slammed the gear shift into drive and hit the gas. Tires squealed against wet asphalt. The city outside, with its neon signs and glimmering windows, blurred into streaks of color as he threaded the Camry through traffic with the precision of a man who had once driven faster, harder, under far worse circumstances. He'd been here before, not with strangers, but with his wife Rachel, years ago. The night her contractions came too soon, the night he'd gripped her hand and whispered everything would be okay when deep down he knew it wouldn't be. That memory threatened to rise, but he shoved it back down. Tonight wasn't about ghosts. Tonight was about this woman in the back seat, clutching her belly like she was holding in the world itself. "Stay with me, ma'am," Jake said, his voice steady even though his pulse thundered in his ears. "I've got you." "You're not alone tonight." Her eyes squeezed shut. She rocked slightly with each turn, each sudden acceleration as he cut down side streets, ran red lights, ignored honking horns. He didn't care about the ticket. He didn't care about the angry faces flashing past him. All he cared about was the sound of her breathing, uneven, sharp, sometimes catching like it might stop altogether. Every mile the silence between his words grew heavier, and yet he kept talking, because silence could kill in moments like this. "What's your name?" he asked, even though she might not answer. "I'm Jake." "Just focus on my voice. In through your nose, out through your mouth, like waves. Don't fight it. I've got you." Her hand pressed harder against her stomach. A muffled groan escaped her throat. The sight of it hit Jake in the chest. Raw, vulnerable, nothing like the polished boardroom executive she must have been an hour ago. In this cab under flickering dome light, she was just human, fragile, desperate, alone. And Jake knew something about that. The hospital came into view like a lighthouse rising out of the fog, its red emergency sign glowing against the midnight sky. Jake's knuckles whitened as he swung the Camry hard into the ambulance bay, brakes screeching. The woman gasped, one final broken cry, as the car shuddered to a stop. Jake was out of his seat in an instant, yanking open the back door. "Hang on," he said, his voice fierce now, carrying more weight than any stranger's voice should. "You're here. You're safe." He waved frantically at the sliding ER doors, and within seconds 2 nurses rushed forward with a gurney. They lifted her gently, though she winced and clutched at Jake's sleeve before they could pull her away. Her grip was shockingly strong, her eyes locking on his for just one heartbeat. There was fear there, yes, but also something else, something like trust, the kind you give not because you want to, but because you have no other choice. Then the moment broke. They wheeled her inside, the automatic doors swallowing her, the night air snapping cold around Jake as if nothing had happened at all. He stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, his breath visible in the streetlight glow. His Uber app still blinked on his phone, trip in progress, as if it had been just another ride, just another fare. But Jake knew better. Some trips didn't end at the drop-off. Some rewrote everything. As he slid back into the driver's seat, he caught sight of something on the floor, a single silver button torn loose from her blazer in the chaos. He picked it up, turned it over in his calloused fingers. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew this. Life had just thrown him into a story bigger than either of them could see, and the echoes of this night weren't going anywhere soon. Outside, the city kept moving. Cabs honked, lights flashed, strangers stumbled home. But for Jake Miller, the night was already branded into his bones. And deep inside the sterile walls of the hospital, a woman fought to bring life into the world, unaware that the man who carried her there had just become a part of hers. The moment the nurses wheeled her away, the doors swung shut with a violence that rattled in Jake's chest. The red emergency sign above them kept pulsing, like a heartbeat against the sterile white of the walls. He stood rooted to the spot, still gripping his phone in one hand, the Uber app glowing mockingly with the words, "Trip in progress." The absurdity of it struck him. People at home ordering rides, chasing parties, stumbling out of bars, while here he was, planted in a hospital corridor that smelled like bleach and fear, his hands trembling like he was the one about to collapse. He told himself it was over. He'd done his part. He wasn't family. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't anyone, just a driver in a grease-stained hoodie, standing in the wrong place, watching a scene that belonged to someone else's life. He should have gone back to the car, clicked "End trip," and melted into the city's blur again. But then her voice cut through the chaos, faint and broken, carried through the swinging doors before they sealed. Don't leave." Something in the way she said it pierced deeper than it should have. Not a command, not even a plea. It sounded like a secret leaking out, the words of someone who had fought too long alone and was suddenly too tired to pretend she didn't need anyone. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. Every instinct told him to walk away, to retreat before anyone noticed he didn't belong here. But his feet moved on their own, slow and heavy, carrying him past the nurse's station, past the waiting chairs where exhausted families slumped over coffee cups, and toward the delivery ward. He stopped just outside the wide double doors, the glass panel giving him a fractured view inside. The room buzzed with motion, nurses darting, machines beeping, a doctor barking orders with clipped authority. The woman, Amelia, though he didn't know her name yet, lay under harsh fluorescent lights, her face contorted in pain, sweat glistening on her forehead. For a moment, Jake felt intrusive, like a trespasser in someone's most private war. But when she turned her head just slightly, eyes fluttering open, they landed on him. For a heartbeat, their gazes held. He didn't move. Neither did she. And somehow, in that glance, he understood. His presence mattered, even if he had no right to it. So he stayed. He stood still in the hallway, the weight of memories pressing in as the sound of life and fear clashed on the other side of the door. He heard her cry out, and the sound tore through him, dragging him back years. To another hospital, another night, when his wife, Rachel, clutched his hand so tight his bones ached. He remembered whispering the same useless words he had whispered tonight. "Breathe. I've got you. You're not alone." But that night had ended in silence, the kind that crushes, the kind that never leaves your ribs. Rachel was gone within hours, their baby gone before she could ever take a breath. All that was left was him, and a life that felt like rubble. The doctors' voices rose, then fell. The machines beeped, then steadied. Jake's fingers curled into fists, his nails biting his palms. He wasn't supposed to feel this, not for a stranger, not here, but grief doesn't ask permission, and neither does hope. And then it happened. The silence split open with a cry, thin at first, fragile as a string pulled too tight, then louder, fuller, a newborn's voice breaking into the world. The sound struck Jake like lightning, a sound he hadn't heard in almost a decade, one that had lived only in his memory. His chest clenched, his vision blurred. For a second he thought he might collapse, right there in the hallway, undone by the weight of something he thought he had buried forever. He blinked hard, willing himself to stay steady. Nurses clapped each other's shoulders, the doctor's voice softened, and the room's frantic rhythm shifted into something gentler. Through the small glass window, he saw them lift the baby, swaddle it in a blanket, and lower it onto Amelia's chest. Her face, pale and exhausted, broke into a look that Jake couldn't name. Relief, pain, awe, terror, all of it at once. She held her child like it was the first solid thing she had ever touched, and in a way, maybe it was. Jake pressed his back to the cool wall, breath shaking out of him in slow, uneven bursts. He wanted to look away, to give her privacy, to retreat into the anonymity he had perfected, but he couldn't. The cry still echoed in his bones, rewriting old echoes with something raw and new. When the nurse finally came out, she brushed past him without question, as if his presence there had already been decided. He stayed standing, shoulders hunched, hands shoved into his hoodie pocket, just another shadow in a hallway that had seen 1,000 such shadows before. Except this time, it wasn't just about watching a life begin. It was about remembering the night his own life had splintered and realizing, with a kind of quiet terror, that some part of him had woken up again. Jake didn't know her name. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But as the baby's cry faded into soft coos inside the delivery room, he understood one thing with a clarity that made his heart ache. This wasn't the end of a ride. It was the beginning of something else, something he wasn't ready for, but couldn't walk away from. And in the hollow silence of the hospital hallway where antiseptic met hope, Jake Miller, widower, father, driver, realized he had just been pulled into a story that belonged to both of them now. The night bled into morning without Jake even noticing. One moment the hall outside the maternity ward had been lit only by the harsh glow of fluorescent bulbs. The next it was streaked with the soft gray of dawn pressing against long glass windows. He sat hunched in a hard plastic chair, elbows on his knees, the hood of his sweatshirt pulled low, as if that could shield him from the weight of what had just happened. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. He'd tried shoving them into his pockets, tried folding them across his chest, but the tremor lived deeper than his fingers. It was the kind that didn't fade with rest, the kind born from memory, from too many nights replayed like scratched records. He told himself he should leave. He wasn't family. He wasn't even a friend, just a driver who had stumbled into someone else's emergency. But every time he shifted forward, ready to stand, something rooted him there. Maybe it was the echo of her voice, "Don't leave," still lodged in his ears. Maybe it was the faint cry of the newborn he'd heard hours earlier, a sound that cracked something open in him he hadn't dared touch for years. Or maybe it was the truth he didn't want to admit. He didn't have anywhere else to be. The hall bustled in waves. Nurses exchanged charts. Orderlies wheeled carts stacked with supplies. Families shuffled in with flowers that would wither by week's end. No one looked at him twice. He blended into the background, the way men like him always did. Hoodie, jeans, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Invisible until needed, forgotten as soon as the crisis passed. A set of footsteps slowed near him. He glanced up to find a nurse holding a clipboard, her expression brisk but kind. "Are you family?" she asked, pen poised, ready to check a box that would let her usher him closer or send him away. Jake opened his mouth, already shaking his head. "No, The door beside him creaked open before he could finish. He turned, startled, and there she was. The woman from the car, the woman who had gripped his sleeve like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. She leaned against the frame, hospital gown draped loosely over her shoulders, skin pale as paper, but eyes startlingly clear. For a second, Jake thought she might fall, but then she straightened, as if remembering who she was. "I'm Amelia Ward," she said, her voice raw with exhaustion, but still carrying a trace of authority, like someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms, even while half collapsing in a doorway. "CEO of Ward Financial." Her lips curved faintly, almost ironic. "You saved my life tonight." Jake blinked. Of all the things he expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. He almost laughed, though not from humor. The idea of a billionaire, someone whose name probably lived in headlines and glossy magazines, thanking a man who drove through the night just to keep rent collectors at bay, felt like the cruelest kind of joke. "I'm just a driver," he muttered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. But Amelia didn't look away. Her gaze lingered on him, steady, studying, like she saw something beyond the hoodie, beyond the calloused hands and tired eyes. For a moment he felt stripped bare under that look, exposed in a way that was unsettling and strangely comforting at the same time. "Sometimes the right stranger changes everything," she whispered. Her voice had softened, the steel in it bending into something fragile, almost secret. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she turned back into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Jake sat frozen, staring at the empty space where she had stood. Her name echoed in his head, Amelia Ward. He rolled it silently over his tongue like a chord struck on a piano, lingering long after the sound had faded. He didn't know why it stuck, only that it did. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another ride request, another stranger waiting somewhere in the city. He ignored it. For once, he couldn't force himself back behind the wheel. Not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes. The hum of the hospital wrapped around him, distant announcements over the intercom, the squeak of rubber soles on tile, the muffled laughter of a family greeting new life. And beneath it all, like an undertone only he could hear, Amelia's words repeated themselves. "Sometimes the right stranger changes everything." He didn't know what she meant. Maybe she'd forget she ever said it. Maybe by tomorrow he'd just be another nameless driver in her rear view. But something in her eyes told him otherwise. Something in the way she had spoken his presence into significance, if only for a breath, told him this wasn't the kind of night you walked away from unchanged. Jake opened his wallet, pulling out a faded photograph of his daughter, Emma, drawn in childish crayon on the back of a school flyer. He traced the lines with his thumb, then slid it back in place. "Don't get ideas," he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The name Amelia Ward was already following him, like a song half finished, waiting for the next verse. He sat there as the morning brightened, shadows lifting off the walls, the city outside waking into its usual grind. The trip might have ended hours ago, but Jake could feel it in his bones. His story with Amelia hadn't, not yet. By the time Jake pulled into the cracked parking lot of his apartment building, the adrenaline that had carried him through the night had drained out of him completely. His body felt heavy, every muscle weighted down with exhaustion that came not just from lack of sleep, but from the strange ache of having lived through something that wasn't his, and yet somehow was. The neon signs of the city still pulsed in the distance, but here the streets were quiet, littered with yesterday's newspapers, last night's bottles, and the kind of silence that comes with forgotten corners of a city that never really cared. He trudged up the narrow stairwell, the smell of fried onions and stale cigarettes lingering in the air. His key stuck, as always, before giving way with a reluctant click. Inside, the apartment was dim, except for the soft hum of the fridge that worked half the time and the glow from the small lamp Emma insisted on leaving on when he was out late. There she was, his daughter, 9 years old, asleep on the sagging couch. Her head lolled to one side, mouth slightly open, a pencil still clutched loosely in her hand. Sheets of math homework were scattered across the cushions like fallen leaves. She must have tried to stay awake, waiting for him, fighting the pull of sleep until her small body gave in. The sight caught him in the chest, the way it always did. Jake crouched down beside her, brushing back a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Her breath came in soft, steady rhythms, the kind of sound that reminded him why he kept moving through nights that felt endless. "You're my reason for every mile," he whispered, words meant only for her and the quiet walls that had held far too many confessions. Their life was small, held together with duct tape and stubbornness. Mismatched dishes stacked in the sink, second-hand clothes folded carefully into drawers that never quite closed, take-out boxes lined along the counter, like some absurd display of trophies earned in survival. He did his best to keep it decent for Emma, patching holes in her shoes with glue, turning bedtime stories into adventures that stretched farther than the four walls of their apartment. But the truth was never far. Bills piling on the table, notices reminding him just how close the edge was. His nights belonged to the car, weaving through neon-lit streets, picking up strangers whose lives brushed his and disappeared just as quickly. His days belonged to Emma, packing her lunches, fixing her hair the way Rachel used to, whispering prayers he wasn't sure anyone heard. It was a cycle, predictable in its exhaustion, relentless in its demands. And yet tonight, something felt different. Amelia. The name lingered like smoke in his chest. The memory of her hand gripping his, the raw fear in her voice when she begged him not to leave, clung to him with a persistence that unsettled him. He had been nothing more than a driver. She had been nothing more than a passenger. That should have been the end of it. Strangers came and went, leaving only the faint smell of perfume or cologne in the back seat, their voices fading the moment the door shut. But Amelia was still there, her presence hanging in the air like perfume that refused to lift. He dropped into the worn recliner opposite the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at his daughter's small frame curled beneath a faded blanket. He told himself it was nothing, that people pass through your life and vanish, and this was no different. But when Emma stirred and blinked sleepily at him, he saw himself reflected in her gaze. "Why do you look so far away, Dad?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. Jake froze. He hadn't realized how visible the weight was, how it sat on his face like an unspoken confession. He forced a smile, the one he always used when he didn't want her to worry. "Just tired, kiddo," he said softly. But Emma wasn't fooled. She studied him for a moment longer, her small brow furrowed in that way that made her seem far older than 9. Then, with the innocence only a child could hold, she whispered, "It's okay. You can tell me someday." She yawned, eyes fluttering shut again, already drifting back into sleep. Jake sat in the dim light, her words echoing through him. Someday. He didn't know if he could ever explain it to her, that sometimes a stranger walks into your life for one fleeting moment and refuses to leave, not in presence but in memory, in the quiet thrum of your chest where their voice still lingers. The city outside his window kept moving, indifferent, alive, in its own rhythm. But inside this small apartment, Jake Miller understood something he hadn't dared let himself feel in years. Sometimes strangers don't vanish. Sometimes they stay lodged in you like a heartbeat you didn't know you missed, reminding you that no matter how small your world has become, it can be cracked open again when you least expect it. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes, Amelia's name flickering through his thoughts like a refrain, waiting for its next verse. And in the stillness, between exhaustion and dawn, Jake realized the truth. His life hadn't shifted tonight in any visible way, but inside, the ground had already begun to move. Across the city, where the skyline was carved by glass and steel, Amelia Ward stepped back into the world that had always belonged to her. Ward Financial's headquarters gleamed like an untouchable fortress, 40 stories of mirrored windows catching the winter sun and throwing it back across Manhattan. A week after giving birth, Amelia was already there, striding across polished marble floors in heels that clicked like metronomes. Her hair was coiled into a sleek bun, her makeup flawless, her smile calibrated to reassure investors and terrify rivals. On the surface, it was as if nothing had changed, but behind that surface, everything had. The boardroom applauded when she walked in, men in tailored suits, women with sharp eyes and sharper pens. She nodded once, slipped into her seat, and launched straight into figures, projections, and acquisitions. Her voice carried its usual weight, each word clipped and exact, but somewhere beneath the steel she heard the faintest tremor. She wondered if anyone else heard it too. They didn't. They never did. That was her gift, making cracks look like polish. By the end of the meeting, she had convinced them all that she was unstoppable, the same Amelia who had fought her way into this empire and refused to yield an inch. She shook hands, signed papers, even smiled for the photographer waiting in the lobby. But when the cameras clicked and the lights dimmed, her chest tightened. She caught her own reflection in the mirrored walls, posture perfect, eyes controlled, and felt like she was staring at a ghost she didn't recognize anymore. When she returned to her penthouse that evening, the silence hit her like a wave. Assistants were still buzzing around, clearing schedules, fielding calls, delivering documents. A nanny held her newborn son, rocking him gently, whispering lullabies in a language Amelia didn't understand. She dismissed them all with a flick of her hand, insisting she needed the night alone. When the last door shut, she stood in the vast space she called home, a cathedral of glass and stone, the kind of apartment that was meant to impress rather than comfort. It was too big, too polished. The silence rang louder than applause ever had. Her son's soft cries echoed through the open rooms, small, fragile sounds that seemed swallowed by the high ceilings. Amelia picked him up, cradled him against her chest, and felt the tiny rhythm of his heart flutter against hers. He smelled of powder and warmth, of something fragile and alive, and yet holding him filled her with a terror she didn't know how to name. She had built her life by being untouchable, impenetrable, by turning fear into fire, but this tiny, helpless life in her arms, was not something she could conquer. It was something she could lose. Nights stretched long and restless. She would lie awake, staring at the crib beside her bed, listening to his breathing, waiting for it to change. Sometimes she leaned in close, pressing her ear to his chest, just to be certain he was still there. Other times she stood at the wide glass windows, looking down at the city that pulsed without pause, and wondered how a woman who could command boardrooms could feel so powerless in her own bedroom. It was in those hours, when the city's hum dulled to a distant murmur, that her mind returned to the back seat of a dented Toyota Camry, to the steady voice that had cut through her panic. "Stay with me, ma'am. I've got you. You're not alone tonight." She remembered the way his eyes had met hers in the hospital corridor, not calculating, not judgmental, but calm, grounded, as if he saw her not as a billionaire, not as a headline, but as a woman who was afraid. The thought unsettled her. Amelia Ward was not supposed to need anyone. Her whole life had been proof of that. Parents who praised her achievements, but never her existence. Partners who admired her power, but flinched at her vulnerability. Every wall she had built had been to survive. But motherhood had cracked those walls wide open, and the one person who had seen her at her weakest wasn't a lover or a friend or even family. It was a stranger, a driver. She hated how much that memory clung to her. In the middle of one particularly sleepless night, her son fussing in the crib beside her, she sat on the edge of her bed and let her head fall into her hands. The city's lights bled through the curtains, casting fractured patterns across the floor. She could still hear his voice in her mind, low and certain, a lifeline in the chaos. She hadn't even asked his name. She had barely thanked him. And yet the memory of him, his steadiness, his calm, his refusal to walk away when she had begged, haunted her more than she wanted to admit. Amelia told herself it was nothing, a fleeting imprint born of fear and exhaustion. People pass through your life all the time. But as she lifted her son into her arms and rocked him back to sleep, she whispered words she hadn't planned. "You'll be safe. I'll make sure of it. I promise." And in the quiet of that glass tower, where silence pressed heavier than applause, she wondered if promises meant anything when even she didn't feel safe in her own skin. The city outside never stopped moving. Stocks would rise, deals would close, her empire would expand. To the world, Amelia Ward was still unshakable. But in the hours between midnight and dawn, when her son's tiny breaths filled the air and her thoughts strayed to the stranger who had steadied her, she felt the truth crack inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if strength was enough. And what terrified her most was the realization that she wasn't longing for more power, more control. She was longing for something else entirely, something she hadn't felt in years, something that sounded, in memory, like a stranger's voice promising she wasn't alone. Months passed, and the rhythm of Jake's life returned to its old, grinding pulse. Every night he slipped behind the wheel of the Camry, logged into the app, and let the city swallow him whole. The glow of his phone became his compass, pings directing him through streets soaked with neon, through the drunken laughter of Friday nights, the lonely silences of Sunday evenings, the restless middle of every week in between. Each fare meant another inch of breathing room. Shoes for Emma, overdue rent paid before the landlord knocked, groceries stacked just enough to make the fridge look less empty. He told himself it was survival, nothing more, and he was good at survival. If Amelia's name ever drifted into his mind, he brushed it aside like static. A stranger, a passenger, a moment that had passed. He had no place holding on to it. That's what he told himself, though some nights he'd catch the faintest echo of her voice. The tremor when she'd begged him not to leave, the look in her eyes when she introduced herself as if she needed him to remember. He'd shake it off, drown the memory in the monotony of rides, and convince himself she belonged to another world. Until the night her name lit up his screen. Amelia Ward. Pick up Ward Financial Tower. Jake froze, his thumb hovering over the screen. For a moment he thought it had to be coincidence, maybe even a glitch. Amelia Ward was the kind of name that belonged to the business pages, not the backseat of his battered Toyota. But the app pulsed again, insistent, waiting for his answer. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, veins standing out against the leather. He could cancel. No one would ever know. But something deeper stirred in him, something that felt like both a warning and a pull. Against every rational thought, he hit accept. The Ward Financial Tower loomed ahead like a monolith of glass and ambition, its lobby spilling golden light onto the dark street. Jake pulled up to the curb, heart hammering in his chest, in a way no traffic stop or near miss had ever managed. For a second, he almost convinced himself she wouldn't appear. Maybe it was just someone with the same name. Maybe fate wasn't cruel enough to circle back like this. But then the revolving doors turned, and she stepped out. Amelia Ward, tailored coat draped over her shoulders, heels clicking softly against the stone. Even from a distance, Jake could see the shift in her. Gone was the untouchable force of the woman who had faced him in a hospital doorway, pale but unbroken. Tonight she moved slower, her posture still poised but weighted, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion no concealer could hide. For a moment, she didn't look like the kind of woman who could crush boardrooms. She looked human. She slid into the back seat, setting her bag down beside her, with a sigh that carried more than fatigue. Jake's hands gripped the wheel, forcing himself to look straight ahead, but his eyes betrayed him, flicking to the rearview mirror. Their gazes met. A flicker passed between them, recognition, memory, something neither of them could name, but both felt. "You again?" she said softly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of surprise and inevitability. Jake almost smiled, though it came out more like a grimace. "The city's small," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. In a city of millions, this wasn't small. This was something else. Silence settled in the car, but it wasn't the strained silence of strangers. It was heavier, charged, the kind that hummed with everything unsaid. Jake focused on the road, weaving through the city with practiced ease, but every sense of him was tuned to the quiet presence in the back seat. He caught her reflection in the mirror, the way she leaned her head against the glass, eyes closed for a moment too long before forcing them open again. She looked tired, yes, but also raw, stripped of the armor he imagined she wore everywhere else. He wanted to ask her if she was all right. He wanted to ask about the baby, about the nights after that frantic drive, about whether she had found peace in the weeks that followed. But the words tangled in his throat. He was just a driver. She was Amelia Ward. Whatever had passed between them that night wasn't supposed to spill into this one. Yet the longer she sat there, the more impossible it felt to pretend she was just another passenger. At a red light, Jake glanced into the mirror again. Amelia's eyes were open now, fixed on him, steady. She didn't look away. For a moment the air between them felt thinner, as if the city outside had disappeared, leaving only this small, moving box of glass and steel. Jake cleared his throat, trying to shake off the weight of it. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice gruff, almost hesitant. Her lips curved faintly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "Rough year," she murmured. And that was all it took. The light turned green, and Jake drove on. But something had shifted in the space between them. This wasn't just another ride. It wasn't coincidence either. In the quiet hum of the Camry, beneath the glow of passing streetlights, Jake realized what his gut had already told him. Some rides aren't accidents. They're crossroads. And once you reach them, you can never go back the same way you came. The ride should have been nothing. A handful of minutes through the city's grid, a fare that barely covered gas. Jake told himself to treat it like any other. But the moment Amelia Ward settled into the back seat, the air in the car felt different. It wasn't just her name, still echoing in his mind from months earlier, or the memory of her hand gripping his sleeve in the hospital. It was the quiet way she sat, coat draped across her lap, eyes turned to the blur of lights outside. Not distant exactly, but heavy, as though she carried something that even glass towers and iron couldn't contain. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Jake kept his eyes on the road, fingers steady on the wheel, though his pulse was anything but. The hum of the engine filled the silence, and he thought that would be enough, that this ride would pass like smoke, vanishing once she stepped out. But then her voice broke the quiet, low and almost hesitant. "How's your daughter?" The question caught him off guard, sharp enough to make him glance at her in the mirror. No passenger had ever asked about Emma. They asked about shortcuts, about music, about how long he'd been driving, never about the one person who kept his world from caving in. "She's good," he said after a pause, the words careful, measured. 9 going on 19. Smarter than me most days." Amelia's lips curved faintly, though her eyes didn't leave the window. "She must be proud of you." Jake almost laughed, though it came out softer, almost sad. "She thinks I can fix anything. I try not to prove her wrong." They drove another block before she spoke again. "How do you survive these hours?" Her tone wasn't casual curiosity. It was weighted, as though she wasn't asking about the job at all, but about the man carrying it. He gripped the wheel tighter. "Survival's a funny word. Some nights it feels like that's all I'm doing, driving circles around the city, chasing rent, chasing shoes that fit her growing feet, chasing—" "Enough." He exhaled slowly. "Sometimes more feels like a luxury. I'm just trying not to lose what little I have left." Silence stretched after that, thicker this time. Jake wondered if he'd said too much, let the cracks show, more than he should have. He wasn't in the habit of spilling pieces of his life into the laps of strangers, especially ones who lived in penthouses he couldn't even afford to clean. But Amelia didn't look at him like he'd overstepped. She just sat there, still as stone, until she finally whispered, "I know the feeling." Something in the way she said it made his chest tighten. He wanted to ask, how could a woman who commanded boardrooms, who moved through the world with armor made of money and power, know what it felt like to fight just to keep hold of the scraps that mattered? But the crack in her voice told him enough. Power didn't erase emptiness. Wealth didn't guarantee peace. Even billionaires, it seemed, lived in rooms that broke them. The car rolled to a stop outside an upscale building draped in glass and marble. A doorman stood ready, glancing toward the car, but Amelia didn't move right away. She stayed seated, her hand hovering near the door handle, as though reluctant to return to whatever waited inside. Finally, she pulled out her phone, tapped a few buttons, and the screen on Jake's dash lit with the completed fare, double the usual. Enough to matter, but Jake barely glanced at the number. What lingered wasn't the money. It was the way her eyes caught his in the mirror for just a beat longer than they needed to. It was the way her voice had cracked. The admission tucked inside 4 quiet words. "I know the feeling." She stepped out, pulling her coat tight against the night air. The doorman greeted her with a polished nod, and she walked inside without looking back. The glass doors swallowed her whole, leaving Jake alone with the hum of the engine and the restless thrum in his chest. He sat there longer than he should have, hands loose on the wheel, staring at the building's reflection of the city lights. For the first time in years, he felt the strange pull of connection to someone who lived on the other side of every barrier he knew. It made no sense, and he hated that it mattered. But as he finally drove off into the night, Emma's crayon drawing slipped in his wallet, Amelia's words pressed against his ribs like a bruise. It wasn't the fare that stayed with him. It wasn't the address or the building's polished glass. It was her voice, soft and breaking, proof that even the untouchable could be undone. And as Jake steered back into the river of headlights, he realized this conversation, brief, fragile, unexpected, would follow him long after the night was over. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of old pipes hidden in the walls. Jake came in late, shoulders heavy from another long night behind the wheel, keys jingling softly as he set them on the counter. He expected to find Emma curled up on the couch, lost in dreams, but the small lamp in the kitchen still burned. Its pale glow stretched across the table, spilling over crayons scattered like fallen sticks and a half-empty glass of milk, long gone warm. Emma was slumped forward, cheek resting against her arm, pencil still loose in her fingers. Her small chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep, but Jake's eyes didn't stop on her. They caught instead on the drawing spread out in front of her. He stepped closer, slowly, as though he might disturb something fragile just by breathing. The paper showed a car, boxy, lopsided in the way children sketch, but unmistakably his Camry. Behind the wheel was a man, his beard drawn in with dark strokes, his eyes wide, fixed on the road. In the back seat sat a woman, her figure bent forward, hands pressed against her middle. And towering behind them all was a building, bright with yellow light, beams radiating outward like a beacon. A hospital, drawn not as a place of fear but as a lighthouse cutting through the dark. Jake froze. His stomach tightened, his heart stumbling over itself. He hadn't told her. Not about Amelia. Not about that night. He had come home from the hospital silent, too tired to explain, too uncertain of what it had meant. Emma had gone on with her days, and he had let her, thinking it was better she never knew. Yet here it was, sketched in crayon, his secret story made visible by a 9-year-old's hand. "That's the night you saved the lady," Emma murmured, her voice soft, words blurred by sleep. She didn't even open her eyes, just shifted slightly, curling her arms closer beneath her head. Jake's throat went dry. "How do you—" He stopped, his voice cracking. Her lips curved faintly, a ghost of a smile in her half-dreaming state. "You dream loud, Dad." The words cut straight through him. For a moment Jake stood there, caught between disbelief and awe. He had always known he carried his past too heavily, that grief leaked out of him in ways he couldn't control, but the thought of his daughter catching fragments of his unspoken memories while she slept beside him, it was both terrifying and tender. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, his tired body folding into the silence. He looked at the drawing again, tracing the uneven lines with his eyes. Emma hadn't drawn Amelia as some untouchable figure, not a CEO or a stranger surrounded by wealth. She was just a woman in the back seat, fragile and human, part of their story whether Jake wanted her to be or not. His daughter hadn't asked for names or explanations. She had simply seen what he couldn't admit. That night had changed something, and the woman wasn't gone. Jake laughed softly, though it was more of a sigh, the kind that carried weight behind it. He reached across the table and brushed his hand gently over Emma's hair. She stirred, but didn't wake. Her innocence was both shield and mirror, shielding her from the weight of what the world could take, and mirroring back to him truths he was too stubborn to face. He folded the paper carefully, the crinkle of the edges loud in the still kitchen. He hesitated for a moment, then slipped it into his wallet, tucking it into the same worn slot that held her crayon self-portrait and Rachel's faded photo. He told himself he didn't know why, maybe to keep it safe, maybe to remind himself it mattered. But deep down, he understood. Throwing it away would have meant admitting that Amelia was only a moment, a passenger, a name already fading. Keeping it meant something else entirely. Jake leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be written in the cracks above. He didn't know what would come of it, whether Amelia Ward would ever cross his path again, or if the memory of her voice would eventually dissolve into the noise of all the nights before. But as he listened to Emma's quiet breathing and felt the folded paper pressing against his chest, he knew one thing with certainty. Strangers weren't always strangers forever. Sometimes they slipped into your story through the cracks, and sometimes your daughter's crayons had a way of telling you the truth before you were ready to hear it. And in that small kitchen, under the glow of a single lamp, Jake realized Amelia's name wasn't just lodged in his chest anymore. It was in Emma's, too. 9 months had passed, though to Jake they felt both endless and fleeting, like the blur of city streets he drove through every night. Winter had hardened into spring, spring melted into summer, and still he worked the same hours, chasing fares until his bones ached and his eyelids felt like lead. This night had been worse than most. A string of drunk passengers, one who threw up in the back seat, another who screamed at him for missing a turn even though the app had glitched. By the time he climbed the narrow stairwell to his apartment, every part of him wanted nothing more than to collapse into the old recliner and let silence swallow him. But silence wasn't what he found. Someone was standing at his door. At first, in the dim yellow glow of the hallway light, he thought he was imagining it. A figure, still, waiting. His heart gave a sharp kick. As his eyes adjusted, the details came into focus. A woman, dressed simply, jeans, a soft blouse, flats that looked worn instead of new, no tailored power suit, no diamond clasp on her wrist, no mask of corporate perfection. And in her arms a small boy, nestled against her shoulder, his tiny fist clutching the fabric of her shirt. "Amelia," Jake breathed before he could stop himself. Her eyes flicked up at the sound of her name, and for a second all the steel he remembered from her gaze was gone. What looked back at him was raw, almost unguarded. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Jake felt it reverberate in his chest. He fumbled for his keys, throat tight. "Come in," he said quickly, as though keeping her out there a second longer would risk her vanishing altogether. The lock turned with its usual stubborn click, and he pushed the door open. Behind him, a soft rustle. Emma had padded out from her room, still in her pajamas, hair a tangled halo around her face. She rubbed her eyes, blinked, and then froze when she saw who was standing there. a woman she had only ever seen in her father's restless dreams and her own crayon drawings. Jake's heart thundered in his chest, so loud he wondered if both of them could hear it. The apartment seemed to shrink, every shadow holding its breath. Amelia Ward, billionaire, Jake Miller, janitor turned driver, and Emma, the quiet witness to a story bigger than any of them had ever expected. 3 worlds colliding in the worn doorway of a place held together with tape and stubbornness. Jake stepped aside, letting Amelia in. She crossed the threshold slowly, as though entering someone else's life required permission she wasn't sure she had. The boy stirred against her shoulder a faint whimper, and she rocked him instinctively, whispering something too soft to catch. Emma stared, wide-eyed, clutching the hem of her father's hoodie. "This is him?" Emma whispered, her voice careful, reverent almost. Amelia's lips curved into a tired smile. "Yes," she said softly, "this is him." Jake shut the door, leaning against it for a moment as though the weight of the night needed holding up. He didn't ask questions right away, not why she was there, not what had driven her across the city to his modest apartment, not what she was risking by being seen like this. The look in her eyes told him enough. Whatever fortress she had built around herself had cracked, and in that break she had found her way to him. He gestured toward the couch, its cushions worn but welcoming. Amelia sank into it carefully, adjusting the baby in her arms until he was nestled against her chest, his breathing evening out again. The sight of her there, not as the untouchable CEO, but as a mother clinging to something fragile, stirred something deep in Jake's ribs. Emma crept closer, cautious, curiosity flickering across her face. "Can I see him?" she asked. Amelia glanced at Jake, then back at the girl, and nodded. Emma leaned in, peering at the baby's small features, his tiny nose, the way his fist opened and closed like he was already reaching for the world. She smiled, wide and unguarded, and Jake felt the air shift. His daughter, who had lived most of her life watching her father carry invisible weight, was now witnessing something else entirely. The beginning of a story she couldn't yet name, but one she already knew mattered. Jake lowered himself into the chair across from them, hands clasped tight together to keep from trembling. He wanted to speak, to ask what had brought her here, to demand an explanation. But all that came out was a quiet, steady, "Why me?" Amelia's eyes lifted, locking onto his. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, in a voice that carried more honesty than he had ever expected, she said, "Because you stayed. When everyone else kept moving, you stayed." The words lodged in him like a chord struck and left ringing. He didn't know what this moment meant, what tomorrow would demand of either of them. But as Amelia rocked her son, and Emma sat close, watching with wide eyes, Jake understood one thing: his life had just shifted again. Not in grand gestures or headlines, but in the quiet collision of 3 lives in a room too small to contain what was beginning. And though he had no map for where it would go, he knew this: some doors don't just open to let someone in. Some doors open to change everything on the other side. The apartment was smaller than Amelia expected, the kind of place she might have walked past 100 times without noticing: peeling paint near the baseboards, cupboards that didn't quite close, the faint hum of an old fridge holding on out of sheer defiance. But there was a warmth to it, too. A pile of Emma's school books sat on the counter, pages marked with pencil smudges. A drawing of a lopsided sun hung crookedly on the fridge, held up by a chipped magnet. It wasn't the life Amelia knew, but it was lived in, real in a way her penthouse never was. She shifted her son in her arms, his small body pressing into her chest as she sank into the chair at the kitchen table. Jake moved quietly, as if afraid of breaking the fragile balance of the moment. He poured water into 2 mismatched glasses, set one in front of her, and took the seat across. His eyes kept flicking from her to the baby, as if trying to make sense of how the woman he had once rushed to a hospital was now here, stripped of her armor, clutching the very life he'd helped deliver into the world. She stared at the glass for a long time before speaking. His father is gone. The words fell blunt, heavy, as though she'd said them so many times in her head that they no longer needed dressing. He walked out months ago, said he couldn't live in the shadow of all this. Her hand gestured vaguely, encompassing her title, her wealth, the empire built on her name. I thought I could manage without him. I thought I could carry both, my son and my company, but she shook her head, lips tightening. Jake waited, his silence not impatient but steady, the kind that gave her permission to unravel. The board is pushing me, she continued, her voice lower now. They want me back, full force. The woman who built the towers, who never blinked. They want me to hand him to nannies, let strangers raise him, and return spotless, untouched. Her fingers brushed the soft curve of her son's head, the fragile weight of him against her. For the first time since she sat down, her eyes lifted to Jake's. They were tired, raw, but there was something fierce beneath them. But I can't. I can't hand him over and walk away. I don't know how to do this alone. Her voice cracked then, breaking like glass. She took a breath, steadied herself, and whispered, "And I remember how you didn't leave." Jake stared at her, the words striking something deep. He didn't know what to say. His instinct was to pull back, to remind her that he was just a driver, a man whose life was strung together by late-night fares and half-empty cupboards. He had no boardroom advice to give, no empire to lean on, no grand solution to offer. What could she possibly see here, in this small kitchen with mismatched chairs, that she couldn't find in every corner of her powerful world? "I don't have anything to give you," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not like what you're used to. I can't solve your board. I can't make them back off. I don't—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her son shifting in her arms. "I'm not asking for that," she said. "I've had people solve things for me my entire life. I've had money, lawyers, assistants, staff, all of it. But none of them stayed when I was on the floor of that car. None of them looked at me and saw anything but weakness to be managed. You didn't leave. That's what I remember." Her words pressed against the room, thick with truth. Jake felt torn open by them because staying wasn't a grand gesture. It was just what he'd done, the only thing he knew how to do when someone was breaking. And now here she was, in his kitchen, asking for something that felt so far outside of what he thought he could offer. He looked down at his hands, calloused and worn from years of work that never paid enough. "I don't know how to be what you need," he admitted, almost to himself. "You don't have to know," Amelia whispered. "You just have to be real. That's more than anyone else has given me." The baby stirred, a soft sigh escaping him, and Amelia's shoulders relaxed slightly as she rocked him. For a moment the kitchen was filled only with that sound, the fragile breath of new life, the hum of the fridge, the distant city beyond the thin walls. Jake sat back slowly, watching her. The billionaire stripped of polish, the woman who had spent her life building towers, now sitting among crayons and second-hand chairs, confessing she couldn't do it alone. And him, the man who had nothing to his name but his daughter, his car, and a stubborn kind of honesty. Two lives that shouldn't have touched, now colliding in a way neither of them had planned. He still didn't know what she wanted from him. But as he watched her press her lips to her son's forehead, her eyes closing for just a second of peace, Jake realized that maybe it wasn't about wanting. Maybe it was about needing something neither of them could name, but both recognized when it stood in front of them. And though he couldn't say it out loud, the truth settled deep in his chest. For the first time in a long time, someone had come to him not for what he could provide, but for who he already was. At first it was the kind of silence that made Jake feel like he should apologize for every square foot of his apartment. The peeling paint near the window, the thrift store couch with cushions that sagged in the middle, the coffee table nicked from years of use. It all seemed louder now that Amelia Ward was sitting there, her expensive shoes tucked neatly beneath her and her son bundled against her chest. She looked out of place, like a portrait hung in the wrong frame. He wondered if she thought the same. Emma, however, had no such hesitation. She climbed onto the arm of the couch, knees pulled up beneath her, studying Amelia with the unfiltered curiosity only a child could manage. Her head tilted, eyes narrowing as if she were piecing together a puzzle. Then, in the way she always did, she let the questions tumble out. "Why are your shoes so shiny?" Emma asked, pointing at the sleek flats that gleamed under the dim light of the lamp. Amelia blinked, caught off guard, and then gave a small smile. "Because I have someone who cleans them for me." Emma frowned. "Can't you do it yourself?" Jake coughed into his hand to cover a laugh. Amelia glanced at him, then back at Emma. "I suppose I could," she admitted, "but I never had to." Emma nodded slowly, as if cataloging this detail into her private list of things that made adults confusing. A beat later came another question. "Why don't you smile much?" The words landed heavier than the first, and Jake felt his chest tighten. He opened his mouth to tell Emma to hush, but Amelia surprised him. She didn't deflect. She didn't bristle. She looked down at her son, traced a finger gently over his cheek, and said quietly, "Because sometimes smiling feels like lying." Emma considered that, then swung her gaze toward her dad, who was standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway. "That's what you say, too." Jake's laugh was short, uncomfortable. "Guess we have something in common." The conversation drifted after that, but the air had shifted. Each question Emma lobbed into the room chipped away at something Jake hadn't realized Amelia carried, a kind of invisible wall, polished and reinforced, the same one she wore in every photo he'd ever seen of her. Here, under the soft lamplight, in a room too small to hide in, those walls showed their cracks. Amelia smoothed her son's blanket, her eyes flicking around the apartment as if cataloging its details, the drawings taped to the fridge, the shoes lined neatly by the door, the small stack of overdue bills tucked under a bowl. She didn't say anything about them, but Jake could see the recognition in her face. For a woman who lived in glass towers, she looked at these imperfections like they were foreign, but strangely grounding. Jake leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with something close to suspicion. Not of her exactly, but of the moment itself. It felt fragile, like one wrong move could send it crashing down. "This isn't your world," he said finally, his voice rough. Amelia looked up at him. "And yours isn't mine. But here we are." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said nothing. Emma filled the silence again, as if she instinctively knew when grown-ups were about to retreat into their shells. "Do you like cartoons?" she asked Amelia. For the first time, a genuine laugh slipped out of Amelia's throat. Soft, but real. "I haven't watched cartoons in years." "You should," Emma said firmly. "They help." Jake shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips despite himself. His daughter had a way of simplifying the world in ways that left no room for pretense. And to his surprise, Amelia didn't dismiss her. She nodded, solemn as if Emma had handed her a business strategy. "Maybe I will." Slowly, Jake realized something he hadn't allowed himself to before. Wealth didn't protect a person from loneliness. He had assumed Amelia Ward, with her power and her empire, must live surrounded by people who adored her, who hung on her every word. But sitting there, her coat folded neatly on the arm of the couch, her son asleep in her arms, she looked lonelier than anyone he had ever picked up in the back of his car. And Amelia, glancing at Emma's messy braid, at the patched cushions beneath her, at the way Jake's eyes softened every time his daughter spoke, seemed to recognize something she hadn't expected. Poverty hadn't erased their dignity. It hadn't taken away the small rituals of care, the drawings on the fridge, the way Emma had claimed the apartment as her own kingdom, the protective way Jake hovered even in silence. They didn't have wealth, but they had each other, and that was a kind of richness Amelia wasn't sure she'd ever known. The three of them lingered in that space, awkwardness giving way to something quieter, something fragile, but unmistakably real. Not friendship yet, not trust fully formed, but the first threads of understanding, spun between questions only a child would dare ask, and answers a woman like Amelia wasn't used to giving. Later, when the boy stirred and Amelia stood to leave, Jake walked her to the door. Neither of them spoke, but when their eyes met, there was no mistaking what had passed between them. Two different worlds had collided, and somehow, instead of shattering, a bridge had begun to form in the middle. The baby was smaller than Emma expected. She had seen them before, wrapped tightly in hospital blankets on TV shows or pushed down grocery aisles in strollers with bright toys dangling overhead, but never this close, never this real. When Amelia shifted the boy into her arms and asked if Emma wanted to hold him, Jake almost stepped in to protest. His daughter was careful, but she was still 9, still all elbows and impulsive energy. But before he could say anything, Emma nodded solemnly, like she was being entrusted with something sacred. Amelia lowered her son into the girl's waiting arms, guiding her small hands to the right position, showing her how to support the head, how to tuck him close. Emma listened with the kind of focus she rarely showed when Jake was trying to help with math homework. And then, suddenly, it wasn't awkward at all. The boy settled into her lap, gurgled once, and blinked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Emma's face lit up. Jake froze where he stood, halfway between the kitchen and the couch, watching the scene unfold as though it had been plucked out of some other family's life and dropped here, into his. Emma leaned down, whispering something too soft for him to catch, and the baby cooed in response, like he understood. She giggled, light and unguarded, and the sound carried through the small apartment in a way that made Jake's throat tighten. Amelia, perched on the edge of the couch beside them, let out a breath Jake hadn't even realized she was holding. Her shoulders, usually stiff with the invisible weight of expectation, eased. "He looks safe here," she whispered, almost to herself, eyes fixed on her son nestled against Emma's chest. Jake didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Safe. That word rarely belonged in his world, not with the constant shuffle of overdue bills, the broken lock on the building's front door, the long nights spent driving strangers through streets that didn't care if he lived or died. And yet here she was, a woman who could buy safety in every form, bodyguards, penthouses, gated estates, sitting in his threadbare apartment and saying her son looked safe here. He swallowed hard, unable to find an answer. The boy let out a squeal that startled Emma, then broke into a sound that was almost a laugh. Emma's eyes went wide. Then she laughed with him, rocking him slightly. Amelia covered her mouth with her hand, and for the first time since she had stepped into Jake's world, her face softened into something almost unrecognizable. The lines of control smoothed out, the sharp edges dulled. She wasn't Amelia Ward, CEO of Ward Financial. She wasn't the woman who commanded boardrooms with fire in her voice. She was just a mother, watching her son giggle in the arms of a little girl who treated him like treasure. Jake sank into the recliner across from them, elbows resting on his knees, torn between awe and disbelief. He had seen Emma draw lopsided suns and stubbornly tie her sneakers into knots, but he had never seen her cradle a baby with such quiet certainty. His daughter, who sometimes seemed too old for her years, was suddenly both child and caretaker, innocence and wisdom braided together in a way that made him ache. Amelia leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "You're good with him," she said softly. Emma shrugged, trying to act casual, but the grin stretching across her face betrayed her pride. "He likes me," she said simply. "He does," Amelia agreed. "He really does." Jake felt the weight of the moment settle on him. It wasn't money, it wasn't empire, it wasn't even survival. It was this. A little girl with crayons on her fingers holding a baby with laughter bubbling in his chest. A woman who had built walls so high even her boardroom couldn't see past them now, leaning into the sound of giggles. It was so ordinary, and yet to Amelia he could see it was extraordinary. The boy's eyes fluttered, and he yawned, small fists stretching before he tucked them back against himself. Emma shifted carefully, looking up at Amelia. "Do you want him back?" Amelia hesitated, her gaze lingering on her son's peaceful face, then shook her head. "No," she whispered, "not yet." So Emma held him longer, humming tunelessly, rocking him the way she had seen mothers do in parks and on sidewalks. Amelia's hand rested lightly on her son's blanket, as though she needed to keep contact, but her other hand dropped into her lap, open, vulnerable, unoccupied. Jake caught it in the corner of his eye, that small gesture of surrender, and he realized she wasn't just letting her son rest in Emma's arms. She was letting herself rest too, if only for a moment. The apartment for once didn't feel cramped or insufficient. It felt full. Full of a sound Jake hadn't heard in too long, laughter that wasn't forced, wasn't nervous, but alive. Full of a presence that seemed to stretch wider than the peeling paint and second-hand furniture. Full of something he couldn't name, but recognized all the same. When the baby finally drifted into sleep, Emma handed him back with exaggerated care, her face glowing with accomplishment. Amelia gathered her son against her chest, but her eyes lingered on Emma with a warmth Jake hadn't seen before. "Thank you," she said quietly. Emma tilted her head. "For what?" "For reminding me," Amelia replied, her voice trembling just slightly. "That joy doesn't have to be complicated." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. When he opened them again, Amelia was rocking her son, Emma was smiling at both of them, and he knew without doubt that something fragile had just begun to take root in his small apartment. Something neither money nor survival could define, something real. The quiet rhythm they had found, Emma's laughter in the evenings, the baby's soft coos, Amelia's guarded but growing ease in Jake's small apartment, didn't last. It never does. Shadows have a way of finding cracks, of slipping back in when life dares to feel light again. It began with a headline. Jake saw it first, printed in bold letters on a discarded newspaper left in the back seat of his car. CEO's Secret Life Exposed. Uber driver in the middle. He froze, fingers tightening on the wheel, eyes scanning the words that blurred together under the streetlight. There was a photo, too, grainy but unmistakable. Amelia leaving his building, her son against her chest, Emma trailing just behind them. It felt like a punch to the gut. In an instant, their fragile cocoon was torn open for the world to see. By the next morning, lawyers circled like vultures. Amelia's ex, the man who had walked out months before, resurfaced with claims of unfit parenting and reckless choices. He filed for custody, painting himself as the stable option, the respectable father, the one who could provide. Amelia knew the truth. He hadn't called, hadn't visited, hadn't cared. But in courtrooms, truth was often less important than image, and image was what he had always been good at. For Jake, the storm was suffocating. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't want to open. Reporters hovered near the building, cameras waiting for him to step outside. He thought of Emma constantly, of her small frame caught in flashes she didn't understand, of her name dragged into something she had never chosen. Every instinct in him screamed to retreat, to shield her, to lock their door and vanish into silence like he had done so many times before. He wasn't built for fights like this. He was built for survival. But then Amelia showed up at his door one night, long after the city had quieted. She didn't look like the CEO from magazine covers or even the woman who had first stepped into his car. Her hands shook as she held them against her sides, her son asleep in the carrier strapped to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but it wasn't just exhaustion that marked her. It was fear, naked and unvarnished. When Jake opened the door, she didn't try to explain. She didn't rehearse a speech or frame it in strategy. She just looked at him and said, voice breaking, "I can't fight this alone." The words hit him harder than any headline. Because it wasn't just a plea for help, it was a plea for partnership, the kind that reached deeper than contracts or courtrooms. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to stand beside her. For a long moment, Jake couldn't move. He stood in the doorway, heart pounding, the weight of Emma's safety pressing against the pull in Amelia's eyes. He had spent years avoiding entanglements, surviving on the edges where no one could take more from him. But looking at her now, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Not power, not pride, just a woman stripped down to her most vulnerable truth, admitting she couldn't carry it all. Behind him, Emma stirred, peeking out from the hallway with sleepy eyes. She took in the sight, Amelia trembling, Jake frozen, and whispered, "Dad?" Jake turned, caught between the two halves of his world, his daughter, whose trust he couldn't risk breaking, Amelia, whose fight was pulling him into a storm bigger than anything he thought he could endure. He crouched down so Emma could see his face, hear the steadiness in his voice. "It's okay, kiddo. Go back to bed." She hesitated, glancing at Amelia, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. When Jake stood again, Amelia was still there, silent, waiting. Her son shifted in his sleep, a small whimper muffled against her chest. Jake's chest tightened. He thought of the night he had driven her through red lights, the way she had clutched his sleeve and begged him not to leave. He thought of Emma's crayon drawing of that night, folded in his wallet. He thought of the laughter that had filled his apartment when his daughter cradled Amelia's son like he was already family. And he realized he couldn't walk away. Not this time. He opened the door wider, his voice low but certain. "Then we fight together." Amelia's eyes shimmered, and for the first time that night her shoulders dropped. She stepped inside, and Jake shut the door against the flashing world outside. The storm hadn't passed. It was only beginning. But in that moment, in that small apartment where two different worlds had collided, there was no billionaire, no driver, no courtroom looming like a threat. There were just two people standing side by side, bound not by circumstance, but by choice. And in that choice, something stronger than fear began to take root. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cold coffee, the kind of place where everything felt rehearsed, where words were sharpened into weapons and wielded without mercy. Amelia sat at the long table, her son in her mother's arms a few rows back, while across from her, the man she once trusted leaned casually in his chair, smug in the armor of his wealth. Spencer Ward wore his suit like it was custom-tailored for arrogance, his legal team arrayed around him like a wall of sharpened teeth. Jake sat at Amelia's side, stiff in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit across his shoulders. He hated every second of being there, not because he didn't believe in Amelia's fight, but because every eye in the room seemed to pin him as the weak link, the outsider. He was. His calloused hands and cheap tie didn't belong in this theater of money and influence, and Spencer's lawyer wasted no time making that clear. "Your Honor," the attorney began smoothly, "we are here because Ms. Ward has made reckless choices. Not only has she neglected her duties as a mother by exposing her son to instability, she has introduced into his life an individual who is wholly unqualified to serve as a role model. Mr. Jake Miller, an Uber driver, a widower, a man living paycheck to paycheck, hardly able to provide even for his own child. Is this the influence we want shaping a young boy's future?" The words hung in the air, cutting sharper than Jake expected. He clenched his jaw, staring at the table to keep from firing back. The lawyer went on, each sentence delivered with surgical precision, painting Jake as a man drowning in his own failures, a burden rather than a blessing. Amelia's attorney rose to object, but Spencer's smirk lingered. He thrived on this, the theater of destruction. To him, people weren't people. They were narratives to be spun, weaknesses to be exposed. And Jake, sitting there in a suit that didn't fit, was an easy target. When Amelia finally spoke, her voice was clear but strained. "Jake Miller is not a liability. He is the man who carried me into a hospital when no one else would. He is the man who stayed when I begged him not to leave. My son is alive because of him." The courtroom murmured, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Spencer's attorney leaned back, unshaken. "That may be so," he said smoothly, "but heroism in a single moment does not equate to stability over a lifetime. Ms. Ward's sentimentality cannot outweigh her son's best interests." Jake felt heat rising in his chest, shame and fury mingling, until he wasn't sure which would spill first. He thought of Emma at home, thought of how many nights he had driven himself raw just to keep food on the table. He thought of how fragile this fight was and how easily men like Spencer could twist the truth into chains. He wanted to stand, to speak, to tell them all what dignity looked like in survival. But before he could move, a small voice broke through the tension. "Your Honor?" Every head turned. Emma stood near the gallery, her small hands balled into fists, her chin lifted with a bravery that made Jake's heart stop. She must have slipped in with Amelia's family, unnoticed until now. His first instinct was panic. He wanted to shield her from this, to keep her far from the storm. But it was too late. She had already stepped into it. The judge frowned, then softened. "Young lady, you'll need to wait." But Emma didn't wait. She took a step closer, her voice steady, even as it wavered around the edges. "He saved her life," she said, pointing toward Amelia. Her eyes, wide and unflinching, swept across the room. "He saves mine every day." The words cracked the courtroom open like glass under pressure. No one spoke. Even Spencer leaned forward, caught off guard by the force of something he couldn't spin. Emma's voice wasn't rehearsed or polished. It was small, but it was true, and truth carried in a way money never could. Jake's chest burned, pride and ache colliding. He wanted to tell her to sit down, to protect her from the weight of what she'd just done, but he couldn't move. He could only watch as his daughter, with her messy braid and her two big shoes, spoke the kind of truth that disarmed every lie in the room. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable but softer now. "Thank you," he said gently. "That was very brave." Emma nodded once and slipped back to her seat, cheeks flushed but eyes steady. Jake caught her gaze for just a moment, and in it he saw something he hadn't in years. Not just faith in him, but certainty. She believed. She always had. When the proceedings resumed, something had shifted. Spencer's attorney tried to recover, rattling off numbers and reports, but the words felt thin, lifeless. The room had already heard what mattered, and when the gavel finally fell hours later, the decision rang clear. Custody remained with Amelia. No further changes would be made without extensive review. Spencer's jaw tightened, his mask cracking just enough to show the fury beneath. Amelia exhaled, her shoulders trembling with relief. Jake sat frozen, the echo of Emma's words still lodged in his chest. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed, questions flew, but all Jake saw was Emma running toward him, throwing her arms around his waist. "I had to say it, Dad," she whispered into his shirt. His throat closed, his hand pressing gently against the back of her head. "You did more than I ever could, kiddo." And as Amelia stepped beside them, her son in her arms, her hand brushing Jake's lightly, he realized something. For once, truth had outweighed titles, and it had come from the smallest voice in the room. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a theater after the final act, people filing out with whispers and shuffling papers. The gavel had already struck, the judge's ruling clear. Custody remained with Amelia. For Spencer, it was defeat disguised behind a tight smile, his lawyers already circling to plan an appeal. For Amelia, it was relief that washed over her in waves, though the fight had left her pale and trembling at the edges. For Jake, it was something harder to name, a knot in his chest loosening after months wound too tight. He stood awkwardly by the door as Amelia gathered her son, rocking him gently against her shoulder, her hands steady even though her eyes shimmered. Emma clung to Jake's side, her small fingers gripping his like she was the anchor holding him to the moment. He looked down at her and saw pride glowing in her eyes, the kind that made his throat ache. She had been braver than anyone in that room, her words slicing through walls of wealth and strategy, with the honesty of a child who knew only truth. When they finally stepped into the sunlight, the noise hit them. Reporters crowded the steps. Microphones jutted forward, cameras flashing like lightning. Shouts rose in overlapping waves. Questions about the ruling, about Amelia's future, about the man at her side who didn't belong in any headline. Jake flinched instinctively, his hand tightening protectively around Emma's. He wanted to shield her, to turn and run. But Amelia moved first. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked straight through the storm. The boy in her arms stirred but didn't cry, soothed by the steady rhythm of her movements. Emma followed, gripping Jake's hand, as if daring him to step into the light with them. And so he did, though every part of him screamed that he didn't belong on courthouse steps beside a woman like Amelia Ward. The crowd pressed in, questions fired like arrows, but Amelia didn't answer. She kept walking until they reached the edge of the barricades, the black car waiting at the curb. Only when the doors shut and the chaos was muffled into a distant hum did she finally let out a breath, long and shaking. She turned to Jake then, her eyes searching his face. "You weren't just part of this fight," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something she'd been holding in. "You're part of us now." The words hung between them, heavier than the judge's ruling, heavier than any verdict carved into court record. Jake's breath caught, his pulse stumbling. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if he even had the right. Part of us. Not just her, not just her son, but Emma too. The three of them, and now him. He looked down at his daughter, still clutching his hand, her face flushed from the day, but steady. She smiled at him, small and knowing, like she had been waiting for this truth longer than he had. Jake swallowed hard, his throat thick. He wanted to tell Amelia she was wrong, that he wasn't built for this, that all he had to give were long nights in a car and a heart that had been broken too many times. But the words refused to come, because somewhere deep inside, beneath all the fear and doubt, something else had settled, a warmth, quiet and steady, like an ember that refused to go out. He was chosen. For years his life had been defined by what was taken. Rachel gone too soon, music silenced by grief, dreams shelved under stacks of overdue bills. He had been moving through the world like a ghost, surviving, not living. But now, standing beside Amelia Ward on the steps of a courthouse, with Emma's small hand in his and a baby's soft breaths filling the silence, he felt something shift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was being pulled back into life. The car started moving, the city blurring past outside the tinted windows. Amelia leaned back against the seat, her son curled close, exhaustion softening her features. But her gaze stayed on Jake, steady, unflinching. "I meant it," she said, her voice low. "You're part of us. Not because you saved me that night, not because you stood beside me in court, because you stayed. When I asked you not to leave, you stayed, and that matters more than anything else." Jake pressed his palms against his knees, staring at the floor, trying to keep his breath even. Words sat on his tongue, but none of them seemed big enough. All he could do was nod, the gesture small, but full of everything he couldn't say. Emma leaned against him, her head resting on his arm, and whispered, "See, Dad?" "She knows what I know." He turned to look at her, startled, but she had already closed her eyes, tired from the long day. He brushed a hand over her hair, his chest tightening with something close to gratitude and terror all at once. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent as always. But inside that car, something had shifted forever. Titles and money and court rulings would fade into memory, but this fragile declaration of belonging, was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Jake sat back, closing his eyes for just a moment. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a man clinging to scraps of survival. He felt chosen. And that single truth, quiet as it was, carried him into whatever came next. The weeks after the ruling felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, a place where nothing had been promised, yet everything was possible. For Jake, life didn't suddenly transform into ease. Bills still came, the Camry still rattled when he pushed it too hard, and his nights were still swallowed by hours behind the wheel. But there was a difference now, a new thread weaving through the grind, pulling him toward something steadier than survival. Amelia was no longer a name in the news or a fleeting passenger in the back seat. She was here, present, learning the rhythm of his world, even as she carried the weight of her own. Jake still drove nights, slipping out quietly after dinner when Emma was brushing her teeth and Amelia was rocking her son to sleep on the couch. The hum of the car and the blur of the city were familiar companions, but now when exhaustion pressed heavy against his bones, he had something to return to. He no longer came home to silence. Some nights he'd find Amelia asleep on the couch with her son curled against her, Emma curled up on the other side, the three of them tangled in a picture that made the peeling paint and second-hand furniture look almost holy. Other nights Amelia stayed awake, waiting with 2 mugs of tea, her hair loose, her questions soft and real in the quiet. Amelia still ran her company. She still strode into boardrooms with her spine straight and her voice sharp, still signed documents that moved millions across invisible wires. But she carved out space that hadn't existed before, space not for image or power, but for presence. More and more evenings were spent in Jake's apartment, where the ceilings were low and the laughter was loud. Takeout containers cluttered the coffee table, chopsticks balanced on chipped plates, Emma animatedly retelling the plot of her favorite cartoon while Amelia leaned forward, listening like it was a quarterly report. Sometimes Amelia even laughed, real laughter that startled Jake the first time he heard it because it was so unpolished, so unguarded, so unlike the woman the world thought she was. Emma thrived in the new rhythm, too. Amelia had insisted on paying for her tutoring, and offer Jake resisted at first until Emma's bright eyes disarmed him. "Dad," she whispered, "she wants to help." Let her, so he let her. And soon Emma's grades lifted, not just from tutoring, but from the sense that her world was expanding, that she had people cheering for her from more than one direction. She adored Amelia's son, rocking him with the kind of patience that made Jake marvel. Sometimes she teased Jake about being outnumbered now. 2 girls and 2 boys, Dad, but you're the oldest, so you don't count. And he'd grin, though inside the thought of belonging like this left him almost dizzy. It wasn't perfect. The walls were still thin, arguments still sparked when exhaustion frayed their edges. Amelia sometimes snapped when stress from the company leaked into the room, and Jake still battled the instinct to retreat when things got too loud, too uncertain. Emma had questions Jake wasn't always ready to answer about what Amelia really meant to them, about whether this was permanent or another chapter that could close. And Amelia herself wrestled with guilt, wondering if she was giving enough to her son while also refusing to step back from the empire she had built. But perfection had never been the point. What they had was messy, fragile, stitched together by takeout dinners and small acts of trust. Jake fixed Amelia's son's stroller when the wheel jammed, hand steady with the same care he once used to tune pianos. Amelia ironed Emma's school blouse one morning when Jake overslept, laughing at her own uneven attempt, but proud when Emma wore it anyway. Emma drew pictures of all of them together, Jake behind the wheel, Amelia at the window, herself holding the baby, and taped them to the fridge, a child's declaration of belonging that needed no signatures. In the quiet moments, Jake found himself looking around the apartment and realizing it no longer felt temporary. The walls hadn't changed, the furniture was still mismatched, but the air was different. It was filled now with the sound of cartoons Amelia pretended not to enjoy, with the cries of a baby soothed by Emma's small hands, with Amelia's laughter echoing in corners that had known too much silence. He had spent years believing life had already passed him by, that the best parts of him had been buried with Rachel, that survival was the only thing left to master. But here, in this imperfect, unpolished rhythm, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: permanence. Not the kind stamped by titles or secured by wealth, but the kind built in moments too small for headlines. The kind that grew roots in takeout dinners and chipped plates, and the choice, over and over again, to stay. One night, after Emma had gone to bed and the baby finally settled, Amelia sat across from Jake at the kitchen table. The light was dim, her hair falling loose around her face, her eyes tired but soft. She didn't speak at first, just looked around the little room as though memorizing it. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "It's not perfect, but it feels unshakable." Jake didn't answer right away. He let the words sit between them, heavy with truth. Then he reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a visitor in his own life. He felt home. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, spilling them into a foyer that looked more like a museum than a home. Marble stretched in every direction, polished to a mirror shine. Chandeliers glimmered like falling stars, and the windows framed the city as if it had been placed there just for display. Jake stepped out slowly, shoulders hunched, his boots sounding too heavy against the pristine floor. He didn't belong here. Every inch of the place screamed it. "This is too much," he muttered under his breath, eyes darting to the towering vases, the sweeping staircase, the walls that seemed to hum with quiet money. He half expected security to step out from the shadows and escort him back to the elevator. Amelia glanced at him, one eyebrow lifting, but her voice was gentle. "It's not about the house," she said. "It's about who's inside it." Emma didn't hesitate the way her father did. She darted forward, her sneakers squeaking faintly against marble, her laughter bouncing off the cavernous space. She ran through the wide hallway like it was a racetrack, arms outstretched, soaking in the vastness with the unfiltered joy only a child could bring. "Dad!" she called, spinning in a circle beneath the chandelier. "It echoes." Jake rubbed the back of his neck, half smiling despite himself. To Emma, the penthouse wasn't intimidating. It was a playground. For him, though, every polished surface reminded him of the gulf between their worlds. He shifted uncomfortably, already imagining how out of place his calloused hands looked against such gleaming edges. Amelia didn't seem to notice his discomfort, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. She walked across the room with quiet ease, her son cradled against her chest, his small fists tangled in her blouse. The boy gurgled softly, his head bobbing, as he tried to look around at the light and glass surrounding them. Amelia kissed the crown of his head, then turned to Jake. "Here," she said, holding the baby out toward him. Jake blinked, startled. "Amelia, I don't—" "Take him." Her tone wasn't commanding, it was steady, certain. Jake hesitated, then extended his arms. The boy settled into his chest with surprising ease, warm and light, his breath puffing against Jake's collar. For a moment Jake forgot about marble floors and chandeliers. The world shrank to the soft weight of the child in his arms. He adjusted his hold instinctively, bouncing slightly, the old rhythm of fatherhood returning without warning. Amelia stood close, watching him with a look he couldn't quite name. Her voice softened. "I don't want a driver. I don't want a savior." She took a breath, her gaze steady on his. "I want family." The words landed heavier than any declaration she could have made. They weren't polished, not dressed in the armor of a CEO. They were raw, unguarded, spoken from a place she rarely allowed anyone to see. Jake's throat tightened. For years, he had lived with the quiet conviction that family was something he'd already had and lost, that what remained for him was raising Emma alone and making sure she never felt the same hollow ache he carried. He had built his life around survival, not belonging. But here, in this penthouse built from wealth and ambition, Amelia was handing him something he hadn't dared to reach for. The possibility of being part of something whole again. He looked down at the boy in his arms, small and trusting, then over at Emma, who was still running down the hallway, laughter echoing like sunlight. For the first time since Rachel's death, the ache in his chest loosened, replaced by something startling and fragile. Hope. Amelia stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm lightly, as she looked down at her son. "He feels safe with you," she whispered. Jake swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the baby's sleeping face. "I don't know if I can give you everything you deserve," he admitted. The words came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. Amelia's hand lingered. "I don't want everything. I want real. I want what we have right here." Jake lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time he didn't see a woman untouchable in her power. He saw a mother, a partner, someone searching for the same anchor he had been missing for years. Behind them, Emma dashed back into the room, cheeks flushed, hair flying. She stopped short when she saw her father holding the baby, her eyes wide with delight. "You look like a family," she said with a grin, unfiltered, uncalculated. Jake let out a shaky laugh, his vision blurring for a moment. He didn't correct her. He didn't tell her it was complicated or fragile or temporary. For once, he let the truth of her words stand. In that marble room, under the weight of chandeliers and echoes, Jake let himself believe that broken things could be remade, believe that survival wasn't the only rhythm left for him, believe that, for the first time in years, he wasn't just holding someone else's child. He was holding the doorway to something he had thought was lost forever. Family. The evening was ordinary in the kind of way Jake had come to treasure. The city outside their window hummed with its usual noise, distant sirens, car horns, the muted thump of footsteps on the stairwell. But inside, the apartment was wrapped in a kind of stillness that felt earned. The lamp on the end table cast a soft golden glow across the living room, illuminating the same thrift store couch that had carried them through so many uncertain nights. Its cushions were worn thin, its fabric faded, but tonight it held something new. Jake sat at one end, his arm draped loosely across the backrest. Amelia leaned against him, her hair brushing his shoulder, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her. Emma sat cross-legged beside them, a bowl of popcorn balanced precariously in her lap, while the baby, now sturdier and curious at 9 months old, wobbled on Jake's knee, gripping his thumb as though it were the most important anchor in the world. There were no lawyers, no cameras, no looming battles, no boardrooms demanding Amelia's precision, no dashboard rides pulling Jake into the exhaustion of survival. Just them. 4 people stitched together not by design, but by brokenness and choice. Jake let his gaze drift around the room. The drawings Emma had taped to the fridge, the stroller tucked against the wall, the stack of board books Amelia had brought over last week, all of it cluttered the space in a way that made it feel fuller, lived in, transformed. He had once thought this apartment was too small, too fragile to hold anything but survival. But now it felt like it was expanding from the inside out, reshaped by laughter and midnight feedings and the quiet courage of beginning again. "Funny," Jake said softly, his voice breaking into the hush. He shifted his gaze to Amelia, who tilted her head toward him, her eyes catching the glow of the lamp. "I thought I was just giving a ride that night." Amelia's lips curved into a smile that carried both weariness and wonder. Her hand slipped into his, fingers intertwining with a steadiness that still startled him. "Turns out," she whispered, her voice low but certain, "you were driving us home." The words settled deep in his chest, reverberating like a chord that had been waiting to be struck. He remembered that night vividly, the blur of red lights, the panic in her breathing, the way she had clutched his sleeve as if it were the only solid thing in her world. At the time, he had thought it was just another moment of crisis, another stranger in need, another night where he did what he could, and then slipped back into the shadows. But it hadn't been that. It had been a doorway. Emma, overhearing, giggled through a mouthful of popcorn. "See, Dad? I told you you'd dream loud." Jake laughed, shaking his head. Guess you were right, kiddo. He reached over and tugged gently at her braid, and she leaned into his side, still grinning. The baby gurgled then, bouncing against his chest, tiny fists batting at the air. Jake adjusted his hold, cradling him close, and for a fleeting moment he felt the weight of both the past and the present pressing against him. He thought of Rachel, of the silence that had once hollowed out his chest, of the nights when hope had felt like a cruel joke. And he thought of Amelia, sitting here now, her hand warm in his, her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. Amelia shifted, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you realize," she murmured, "we've built something none of us could have imagined?" Jake nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Out of scraps," he said, "out of second chances." She smiled faintly. "That's what makes it real." For a while they didn't speak. The television played quietly in the background. Emma whispered stories to the baby as if he could already understand her, and Amelia's breathing evened out against Jake's shoulder. The room smelled of buttered popcorn and baby powder, sounds of the city faint against the stronger hum of something closer. Belonging. Jake closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He knew there would still be struggles, long nights driving, Amelia's battles in the boardroom, Emma's endless questions about the future. But for the first time in years, the unknown didn't scare him, because he wasn't facing it alone. He opened his eyes again, looking at each of them, the daughter who had saved him with her stubborn faith, the woman who had walked into his life like a storm and stayed like a promise, the baby who represented not loss, but possibility. He had thought his story ended long ago, that survival was all that remained. But tonight, on this thrift store couch, he realized something else. Endings sometimes disguised themselves as beginnings. The popcorn bowl slipped from Emma's lap, scattering across the carpet. She groaned, diving to collect each piece, and Amelia laughed softly, her hand still resting in Jake's. The baby squealed, delighted by the chaos, and Jake couldn't help but join in, laughter rising in his chest, until it spilled out into the room. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was theirs. And as Jake held the baby close, his daughter's laughter echoing in the small apartment, Amelia's hand steady in his own, he felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't survival anymore. This was the second beginning. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Jake and Amelia's journey resonated with you most? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because more stories of hope, second chances, and unexpected beginnings are on the way.